Hello, everyone, and welcome to the infrastructure stage. My name is Bob Burgoyne, and I'm going to be introducing the stage. We'll give it a few seconds just to let people acclimatize to the new environment after that fantastic keynote session that we heard earlier. We've got an exciting hour ahead of us. I'm going to do a brief scene setting introduction and then hand over to our fantastic panel moderated by the Carbon Trust's Elaine Smith Gillespie. There's an opportunity to pose questions throughout, so please do go ahead and do that, and the panel will get to as many of them as they can at the end. So, to briefly frame the discussion, as we heard earlier, the business response to the climate emergency has two related imperatives: reducing emissions and making preparations for the impacts of global heating. How to respond is, of course, as Laura Clark said earlier, not an easy question to answer. We have reporting frameworks like the CSRD and the TPT that provide a useful way to think these things through. And I look forward to the panel discussion later on how they've moved from that thinking and planning to the implementation phase. So, the climate emergency is, of course, impacting us all, but in many ways, companies in the infrastructure field are at the sharp end of things. And we're seeing radical change across ICT, construction, and of course, the energy and power sectors. Just to share a few examples here, tech companies are driving the demand for electricity, and that electricity needs to be clean. An example of the response to that is Amazon, who've recently signed a power purchase agreement with a nuclear power station. And Sam Altman, the father of generative AI, believes that we need to accelerate the development of fusion power to be able to scale that technology. Whether or not that's a good thing is a matter of debate, but that's what he said. On the climate impact side of the equation, Dubai has seen unprecedented floods earlier this year, and they responded rapidly with a huge announced investment in infrastructure. Now, of course, we don't all have the resources available of Dubai, and so from a perspective of planning, we need to be more thoughtful in terms of design to prepare our assets for a more extreme future. Finally, of course, the climate crisis is about the energy transition, and China's taking a global lead here in terms of building renewable generation capacity. The cost of solar energy has fallen precipitously over the past 5 to 10 years. And there's lots of headline grabbing statistics about the sheer amount of solar power China is spinning up and how quickly it's doing that. Now, some businesses are driving this change and others are reacting to it. So an interesting question, I think, is what is the right balance of planning and building reactive and adaptive capacity? In a sense, both things are needed. And at the Carbon Trust, we believe that with an uncertain future, transition planning is necessarily an iterative process. And most thoughtful businesses have developed already an understanding of their carbon footprints through the analysis phase and through TCFD compliance and other exercises. They've begun to think about climate risks and opportunities and the impacts on their business. The implications of that analysis, of course, plays out in strategy, and that informs action in terms of driving internal change, accessing finance, as we heard earlier, and of course, also developing partnerships to enable change across the wider value chain. The good thing is that this drives impact. That impact, of course, needs to be accurately measured, but then closing the loop, that then feeds back into the next iteration of the analysis and strategic planning loop. The world doesn't stand still, and companies need to be able to kind of iterate and respond accordingly. One thing that we're seeing on that note across our client base is an evolution of the climate response from a thing that the sustainability team has to worry about, perhaps with a bit of input from marketing and compliance, to something that's increasingly being recognized as something the entire business needs to grapple with to remain relevant in a net zero world. Hence, rather than transition planning, we might perhaps talk about transformation planning. And with that provocation, I'm going to hand over now to Elaine and our panel to discuss this further.
Thank you, Bob. That was a great scene setting of many of the issues facing companies with respect to transition planning. We will now hear from leaders on the front line of transition planning within their organizations who will share their experience and insights. This will be a discussion format, which I hope you will find informative. As Bob mentioned, we will leave some time later in the session to answer your questions, so please submit them as we go along via the chat function, which you should see on the platform. My name is Alen Smith-Gillespie. I'm a director at the Carbon Trust, and it is my great pleasure to welcome to the stage our three panelists. Pia Tanskanen, Head of Environment at Nokia, Ian Heisman, Director of Sustainability at Taylor Wimpey, and Christy Patterson, Senior Sustainability Manager at Iberdrola Offshore Renewables. Welcome, Pia, Ian, and Christy. It's great to have you here. So we've been learning a lot this morning around various issues and various perspectives regarding the transition plan. And I would love to hear and for you to share with our audience your, I guess, opening perspectives on the issues. Would you be able to share with us the journey that your companies have been on in developing their transition plans or your transition plans, and perhaps touch on some of the foundational elements to get this underway, which we can of course explore more during the course of the discussion. Pia, perhaps may start with yourself. Could you give us your perspective from Nokia?
Okay, hey, thank you. With Nokia, we have actually very long history when we talk about sustainability and managing environmental impact. We've been measuring and reporting our climate impact more than 20 years now. But what really changed the whole thing was the Paris Agreement in 2016, when the world together really agreed that there's a certain science-based criteria how to set targets as a company and what should we all doing together in order to mitigate the climate risk that we are facing. So Nokia joined a science-based target initiative and got our first targets already in 2017. But what we have seen in this journey is really that every couple of years we see more that we need to do more and more. So we recalibrated already our targets in 2021 to be aligned with 1.5 degrees global warming scenario and have now set a net zero target. ESG is part of Nokia's corporate strategy. It's one of the pillars there. So there's a big commitment for the company to really look climate from the perspectives of the corporate strategy, how to integrate that into our finances and into our technology strategy.
Thanks, Pia. Yeah, great thoughts there. Christy, on a different industry, what has been the journey there for Iberdrola, and what have been the key elements so far?
It's a great question for me, particularly because actually when I've just joined this team that I'm in currently, which is our offshore sustainability team, and took on this job actually of making our sustainability strategy for global offshore wind industry. So this is a really, really great question for me, given this is what I do every day. But very similar to Nokia, Iberdrola has been reporting on sustainability and working to reduce its impacts on the environment and mitigate climate change for a long time. But actually in 2022, we really upped the ante and we announced some very, very ambitious sustainability targets in our Capital Markets Day. Ultimately ending in net zero by 2040, 1.5 degrees aligned, but with some quite ambitious milestones in between to make sure that we're on track and accountable. So when I took this job 2 years ago, as you can see, I worked specifically for our offshore wind business area. What my job was to translate those corporate level targets into an action plan specific for our offshore wind business to make sure we're really delivering at this business technology level. And so the first thing I really did when I took on this challenge was I made sure I fully understood the goalposts, not just numerically in terms of the 2040 target, but actually what success would look like in terms of transforming our business model. So I spent a lot of time looking at our business processes and systems and where those needed to be updated to really make sure that sustainability decisions could be made and those drivers could be considered alongside other things. And so that really formed a foundational part of establishing our KPIs as we moved along this journey. And I think that's one of the things I would really stress for anyone who's new here, because actually 2040, it's not long away in terms of what we need to do, but it's certainly not going to be something you can evidence tomorrow. However, updating your systems and processes, which is the absolute foundation of change, is something you can do quickly. If you have the right KPIs in there, you can articulate some really nice quick wins, and also make sure that you're creating momentum for change. You've got the right foundations there for actual target delivery in due course. So that was the first thing that I did, was really set those goalposts numerically in terms of decarbonisation, but also in terms of systems and process updates. And then after that, I followed the carbon. So we worked with the Carbon Trust and we built a carbon calculator, and we figured out where all of our carbon hotspots were in our business area. And after we figured that out, we looked at which ones were easier and more challenging to reduce. And then we designed some interventions specific to those. And this again links into that systems and processes piece. While we might not be able to have net zero wind farms tomorrow, I can certainly identify all the decisions that we need to change, make, update, so that that is the reality for our portfolio in the future. So just examples of that: steel is a huge one for offshore wind. We use a lot of steel. It's very greenhouse gas intensive, as we know. So a simple solution: we know the steel is the carbon hotspot. What's the decision process that affects how we purchase steel? It's our procurement system. So what we did was we designed interventions that specifically targeted that, so that we had options and the ability to make different choices. So the solution has been so far minimum requirement documents for how we purchase steel. So we've got some specifications in there for low carbon steel being prioritized. And that's really what we've done, but at a large scale over all of our carbon hotspots now. And we've mapped that out in terms of quick wins for now, right out to 2040, bigger transformations that we need to ramp up in due course. So those are really the foundational pieces. The last thing I'll say quickly is that never underestimate the importance of change management when it comes to sustainability strategies. This is definitely a game of change management. Change management practices are so important, because ultimately this is changing your business model. It's changing how you purchase things. It's changing how you financially model things. It's something your CEO needs to be completely on board with, because it is transformational. And so a lot of persistence is required, a lot of patience is required, a lot of working with people to capture hearts and minds and lead them through this change is essential. So that would be my kind of overview for the journey we've been on over the last 2 years.
Yeah, great overview, Christy. I like the expression you've used about following the carbon. Absolutely, that's good, and I think we will definitely revisit many of the themes you've just mentioned during the course of this discussion. And finally, Ian, from your perspective, perhaps giving a bit of background on the company and the journey you've been on, and also similarly, what are the key things that I guess the key opening messages that you'd like to point out as we delve into this topic.
Sure, thanks very much, Alan. Well, Taylor Wimpey, as many people may know, is a FTSE 100 home builder. We built 10,000 homes last year, 14,000 a year before a market slowed down. We've got a small business in Spain. The model is identifying and buying the land, getting the planning permission, building the homes and selling the homes and making an exit. We've been on this journey as well a reasonably long time. So we started measuring our carbon footprint in 2009, setting our first carbon targets in 2013 and science-based targets in 2020. So the big point of inflection, though, came last year with the publication of our Net Zero Transition Plan, 1.5 aligned with the Transition Plan Task Force guidance, and SBTi verified on our targets. So a big step that took a long time, a lot of work to get to that place. And what are the key drivers for our home building business? Well, probably two. First one is around regulation. The homes themselves are very heavily regulated in terms of the emissions and the energy, and in addition, stakeholders. So key stakeholders such as investors, customers, local planning authorities, all very interested in this subject, and some really good business benefits from doing that. What does the decarbonisation of a home building business look like? Well, if we move to the homes, first of all, through the Future Homes Standard, which is the sort of next set of building regulations to come in, we'll be building universally net zero ready homes. What's a net zero ready home? It's a home that's all electric, has no direct fossil fuel heat or power, and will be true net zero once the grid decarbonizes and the only all the electricity is green that's provided to it. So in order to achieve that, there's lots of technology and technology change that's gone into that. And we've been building net zero ready pilot homes in East Anglia over the last year. These are now occupied and we're doing post-occupancy work. These got a whole array of different technologies in, from air source heat pumps to thermal skirting boards to wastewater heat exchangers, lots of other things in order to test in real time these technologies. Operations is also an important area, but perhaps less challenging. It's only a very small fragment of our carbon footprint, and we've already up to 80% purchase of green electricity. Gas will get largely removed through the Future Home Standards, so we've got a focus on diesel as the key part of our operational footprint. We've got some solutions there, but more to do. But the biggest part of this is the supply chain. This is decarbonising all the big ticket materials like concrete, and blocks, groundworks, and other things, and that will be a long-term project. We've also been focusing on the links with other agendas, nature-based solutions, the circular economy, the use of building materials such as timber, the just transition, so all of those feature in our net zero transition plan. We've also been making some moves such as setting up a timber frame factory to help us hit our target of 30% timber frame homes by 2030. And putting in governance structures and incentives into the business. So we're moving on that journey at the moment.
Obviously, a lot of things that you're doing at Taylor Wimpey, and it is hopefully so motivating for people to hear the range of actions and initiatives that each of your companies are doing. Clearly, a lot has to go in there. There's a lot of external factors, internal factors, very important points around changing processes and picking up on the point that Christy made about also changing your business model, which I think probably affects all companies. So given all of these things, it's obviously very important about how you make that case, so given the amount of effort that needs to go in, how has, given the uncertainties of getting to net zero, there's some things that what you need to do, but also you're acting in a space where it's not always obvious what the full risks or opportunities might be going forward. How do you actually make that case to start this journey? Is it sort of little by little, sort of in the background, but obviously at one point you need to make a big change? Some of you mentioned having the buy-in from the CEO. How do you make that business case? How do you make the case for this scale of ambition and change that are required? Pia, perhaps back to you. How has it been for Nokia?
Hey, thanks. I really like what Christy was saying about the change management, and that really is a big change management that needs to happen everywhere in the company. Going back to also what Ian was saying, like it's everywhere. It's about how do you manage your supply chain? How do you design your products? How do you run your own operations? How do you work with your customers? What are they needs for your products that you are providing? So really, it's everywhere. It's little things, it's small things, it's bottom up, it's top down. So all of that, I would say, is needed. For us, of course, it helps that our top management is very committed, and ESG and climate is part of our corporate strategy. So we really have this commitment for the company to move towards net zero. But when really looking at, because net zero is so holistic approach, it really covers all of your business activities, scope 1, 2, and 3, and really the whole value chain activities, and needs to be there. So how to make it happen is really working case by case on really providing, for example, business cases for each different actions that you are taking. And also it was mentioned this materiality topic, like where are your hotspots? So understanding the data, really understanding what are the places where you can gain the biggest improvements, and do you have any low-hanging fruits somewhere that you can actually and you need to do immediately? What are the long-term challenges that you may have? How the world is changing. The opening speech was really also, I really like this iteration, because things are changing so fast in the world around us, which is impacting the activities the companies are taking. And regulation is changing, our customers are changing, and especially in our technology industry, our products are changing and the business is changing. So you really need to be flexible and do iterations and react also on different, for example, stakeholder interests that you might have.
Yes, and to build a bit on that, Pia, it's really interesting what you're saying there. Are there any particular things that you found? I guess it's about tapping into and understanding the different interests within the business. And I think you mentioned that you always need to make a different business case for different parts of the business. Are there particular things in Nokia that you feel have resonated so far? Obviously, there's a lot of things, as you mentioned, changing regulation, competitive aspects. But when you talk with different parts of the business, are there particular themes that come up and say, okay, actually, I really buy into this because now I understand this is what's important to us? Any patterns you've seen out of interest?
One big change has been in the recent years the interest of the corporate financing to ESG. So many of our corporate loans, revolving credit facility, the recent sustainability-linked finance network and the related bonds are all tied to climate performance. So that's a very big change in let's say 2 or 3 years. But also our customer interest. We have a dialogue with our customers on climate topics. How can we work together? How can we share data? What do they need from us on regular basis? We even have set up these customer councils for different regions, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia, to really have a dialogue with our customers to understand their needs and see how can we better work together. So this really, we see climate action also as a competitive advantage.
I think certainly, I think many companies are seeing where their customers are coming to them. That's probably one of the most powerful incentives to take action. And there's been a real flourishing, as you say, Pia, of the sustainable finance scene as frameworks and taxonomies have come in place, and there's a lot of investor interest in channeling finance towards high impact, sustainability impact areas. That's really interesting to hear. From your perspective, Ian, perhaps on your end, how have you made that business case? You've been on a long journey, actually. It sort of almost feels like it's been rather organic and gradual, starting early, being at the forefront, being perhaps one of the forerunners of this in the industry. So has it been an easy ride so far, or are there things where actually you've really had to make that case and it's been difficult? What have you found the things that have resonated most in selling internally or working with your colleagues on making that case for the scale of change that you need to do?
Yes, I think it's definitely been a builder, but change seems to come in quite significant increments and quantums. You put a lot of effort in, nothing happens, and suddenly there's a big change. And the two sort of big drivers, I think, for my sector are regulation and stakeholder views. On regulation and through building regulations, in order to build anything, you have to comply with the local building regulations or the national building regulations. And there's been a move over many years and decades, in fact, towards lower carbon homes. But the big steps are occurring now, as I mentioned, towards zero carbon ready homes. So that's really big. But I think that regulation should also play a big part in the embodied carbon as well. We're not there yet. We're doing a lot of background work and collaborative work to get to a place where we can start to move towards regulated embodied carbon. But we need to do that foundational work in order to do that credibly and effectively. So regulation is absolutely critical, and in some ways that's an automatic business case because we comply, so that's easy. On the stakeholder side, probably the most powerful group has been investors. So their interest has really gone up and up over years. Perhaps there's a little bit of a two-way conversation on investment at the moment, but nevertheless, that's been a very powerful driver for our business. And I've been attending investor meetings last year, probably a couple each month. So really a lot of interest in that. But it's not just investors; it's customers as well. We've done some deep dive customer research in 2020 and 2022. And their customers really care about low and zero carbon homes. Although you mustn't use that language, you must use the language of homes that are comfortable and homes that are cheap to run. And there you can have some really great engagement with the customer base on that. I think it will ultimately become a hygiene factor, but with the cost of living crisis, low bills are really, really attractive. And then, of course, in order to have a business, we need to get planning permission. And there are lots of ambitious local planning authorities who've got the power to set their own local regulations through planning on the carbon agenda. So we need to meet their expectations, and this does that. So there's sort of a combination of regulation and stakeholder drivers that push the business case across the line.
Yeah, I really like how you brought out the aspect of aligning with the customer needs and customer interests. That's really powerful. And on your end, Christy, the offshore wind industry is seen obviously as one of the big enablers of global decarbonization, of helping the rest of the world reduce carbon emissions. One, on the face of it, might not expect offshore wind to perhaps worry about that much, or that it's highly, sustainability necessarily as important as in other industries that need to themselves decarbonize. So how do you create that business case? Where does the case for it come from you? We heard from Pia and Ian, there's regulations, there's customer demands. Where's the impetus coming from your end, and what are the most striking elements of making that case for change?
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually the answer is quite similar to Pia and Ian. So as you say rightly, the renewables industry, we are producing clean energy, we're essential to the energy transition, but because we're not actually there yet, we're still totally dependent ourselves on fossil fuels for our construction, manufacturing and operations. So we still have a journey to go on, particular Scope 3 emissions, which for an average offshore wind farm that we're looking at is more than 98% of our emissions that we're estimating currently. So we do have quite a specific journey to go on there that's very much entwined with everyone else's decarbonisation journey. And one of the big impetus for that is because net zero is net zero, and ultimately we are all supposed to be on that journey. And if we're not promoting our Scope 3 decarbonisation, we're not actually producing the renewable energy that we need for the future. We're not actually net zero compliant. So that is ethically the argument there, that we still have a very big role to play in making sure that our Scope 3, our supply chain, is along that journey with us. But also, just as Pia and Ian were saying, so investments is a huge business case for us as well. So at Iberdrola level, we do attract a lot of green financing because of our ESG credentials, our high investment in our renewable energy business. It's showcasing that we're actually backing a business model that's fit for a net zero future. And part of a lot of green financing at a project level comes from being able to showcase that you're actually actioning your ESG and sustainability targets at a project level. So there's a very clear project-specific business case there. But actually, the renewables industry, and specifically in offshore wind, I guess maybe because of this real desire to be part of that net zero future, we are actually seeing a lot of regulation and ambition coming forward in the sustainability space, predominantly when it comes to securing new projects. So what we've seen in the last 2 years is a real upward trajectory of sustainability non-price criteria being used in seabed auctions, so obtaining the rights to develop an area of the seabed from the government. What we're seeing is that the developer who wins those rights are quite often the ones that can display the strongest ability to do so, to develop that site sustainably. Sometimes even with greenhouse gas emissions caps being put onto that site, so you have to remain within an intensity over the period of its life. So those are examples of really specific business cases as well, because if we can't prove to the government that we are going to be able to remain under that cap, we just simply won't win the project. And so we've really got a very project level impetus for that change as well. Of course, that is specific to markets that are using sustainability non-price criteria to award projects and route to market and consenting. There are markets where that is not the case right now. And we do have more of a challenge there to make sure that our business case is watertight. And I think it is important to acknowledge that even when you do have really strong corporate targets, you're always going to have to justify your business case at a project level to make changes. And that's actually a really, really challenging part of this job for a lot of us, because it's not always black and white. But I think the key that I have found personally is actually supply chain growth and the importance of that. So when I'm finding myself in a spot where it's a bit harder to justify project level action, even under the corporate targets we have, I usually try to link it back to, well, if we're all supposed to be at net zero by 2040, we need to start supporting the supply chain. And this is one of the best ways to do this. Even if you don't directly benefit yourself today, your project, the next one will, the next one will, the next one will, because all we will be doing is supporting the supply chain, signaling to them strongly to invest in these more sustainable solutions that we will be purchasing at the project level. So that is one of the ways where how I leverage the sustainability strategy that we have, which is largely focused on supporting the supply chain to decarbonize. But it is challenging, and I honestly don't think everyone will get it right 100% of the time. And a lot of it, as Pia said, is flexibility and adapting and trying new things and trying to diagnose why that business case maybe didn't work for that project, how you would adapt it for the next one, because it's not always black and white. It's not always simple. So.
Yeah, so continuous learning, continuous improvement, and the point on the supply chain, it's an example of investing in the future. So you start now, you'll reap the benefits as you do it. And many times, the industry might reap the benefits, but they come back to you as well. You made a really interesting point, Christy, about that even when you have strong corporate targets, you still need to be continuously justifying them, which is interesting because that's actually a point that was made earlier in the plenary, where the time horizon in which companies are setting targets and thinking about climate is quite different to the usual planning and even strategy cycle of companies. There's lots of urgent, even sometimes quarterly objectives that companies need to hit. There's a lot of scrutiny for the day-to-day. This is an open question to all three of you, I guess. Perhaps just share a little bit about, what do those challenges look like? What are the sort of situations you feel that have arisen, and how have you tried to tackle these things? This is, lifting the hood a little bit on this. Do you all see this as a real challenge? What makes things smoother? I mean, maybe it's just more of the same about those continuous drivers. But when it really comes to it, is it quite challenging actually? Do you have to keep on renewing, I suppose, the company commitment, and how do you go about doing that?
So from my perspective, that's really sometimes challenges when we talk about really long-term targets, because company strategy is not really looking at such a long-term. People are really busy with the next week almost and next month in many cases trying to get things done. Hearing the comment often like, I will not be here anymore, all of these things. So that's why it's so important to have a roadmap and really tie your long-term targets to little steps, that what needs to happen this year in order for us to reach the targets later on. But from Nokia's perspective, also the interesting fact, if you look at our company history, how much we've been changing. So 20 years ago, we were still doing mobile phones. We were in the consumer business. Today, B2B telecom infrastructure. So in many cases, really looking longer term, the company technology industries going through such a big changes all the time, and the companies is changing. We are doing acquisition, mergers and acquisitions and all of that. So it's really important to have shorter term targets and then the longer term vision supporting each other. But the nice thing I like with the longer term targets is that what we have seen historically is that our reductions for the emissions, they are not linear. So it's not like every year you can do 3%, 5%, and but rather you do big steps, you invest in something, you see big reduction, then maybe a couple of years you really are not reducing so much. So in that sense, the long-term targets are really supporting the goal that we need to go down, but maybe the same amount of the reduction is not happening every year. So long-term follow-up target setting is really helping, but then you also need to look what you can do year and after year.
Well, you make a really good point that the context of companies are constantly changing. You know, you mentioned not only the structure of companies with acquisitions and divestments and mergers and so on, but also in your spaces of technology shifts, as you said, you know, there can be big changes. So back to your point, Pierre, you said earlier on, it's important to stay dynamic. So I think it's probably inevitable that you have to keep on justifying or reviewing the case. However, it does have to go in one direction, right? And so, how, I guess, building on that question, how do you as companies keep that view? I guess keep the eye on the ball. Does it help? Does it help having those long-term targets? And how do you perhaps try to align and perhaps Christy, you mentioned earlier on about processes. So there's things, for example, even aligning incentive targets, whether it's salary, whether it's bonuses, whether it's other things where actually in the midst of the busyness that companies have, they still are pointing that direction. You know, are there any tips that you have or examples that you've seen that have helped you keep your organizations on track?
I mean, one thing I'm trying at the moment, and I think just to caveat again that I'm only 2 years into delivering the strategy, so we're definitely a way of learning still. But one thing I'm actually trying is splitting interventions to keep people on track with the targets and keep people motivated and culturally aligned to them into things that are actually just become cultural norm, things that people just do, and it's actually not questioned anymore, versus more inspirational, active activities. And the reason for that is because when we talk about the busyness of day-to-day life, the problem we sometimes have with sustainability is that even if you have a workforce that's hugely passionate about sustainability and really wants to integrate it into their job and move things on, if they're super busy, it's just really difficult to do, and it is going to slip to the bottom of the pile. And it's not because people don't care, it's because they just actually don't know how to do it. And so a lot of what I'm doing is actually just taking the sting out of that and making systems and processes that are super easy for people to make sustainability happen. And that's where I spend a lot of my time on the intervention design, really working with stakeholders, like why was it so challenging? Not questioning them why they didn't make a better choice, but what was so difficult about making this choice, and how can I take that away so that the reason it was no was because it was genuinely not commercially viable for this project, rather than because we didn't have the energy, we didn't have the skills, we didn't have the time. And so that's a very big part of my strategy, is more subliminal, making things much easier for people, for it to become the status quo. And that has helped, although it can take a while to make those interventions work. So I would caveat there. And then the other aspect of it is just leveraging the passion that people do genuinely have for net zero. So we do have a very, particularly in renewables, and this might be, I'm not sure, I'm sure this isn't just unique to us, but we do have a lot of people who really care about this and actually get a lot of job satisfaction from having the opportunity to deliver sustainability in their job. And so my team, even though we're the sustainability team, we do not do sustainability alone. What we're doing is empowering every single person in our company to integrate it into their job, whether they're an accountant and they're looking for green financing opportunities, whether they are a design engineer and they're looking to help us make our wind farms more modular and easier to decommission. We're embedding it into everything that everyone else does, so they have a genuine sense of satisfaction and purpose. And not only is that going to help us with the scale and speed of change that we need, it's also going to stop us from working in silos and not having the skills and expertise in just our team to keep people on track. So that would be the 2 tips that I'm currently leveraging for when things are a bit tougher on a business case point of view: subliminal support and inspiring through people genuinely wanting to just deliver sustainability in their job.
Ian, it sounds like you want to come in.
From our perspective, a number of years ago, I think probably in common with lots of house builders, there was an intense focus on this and next year's financials. But I think in many ways, sustainability has been the key to changing that, to having a much longer term view. So we're out to 2045 with our net zero target, and we've got a very structured plan leading to that. So that's been accepted by the PLC board, by the UK board. Been endorsed, we're socializing it, and we've got a plan. So for each section of time, usually 5-year horizons, we've got some very specific actions to fulfill. So then it's just about that's culturally embedded, and it's about delivering on those agreed actions. So in some ways, there's of course a lot of short-term requirements, a lot of market changes, a lot of things to navigate and negotiate, but that's now very strong and in the business, and we're working within that framework and that plan to deliver net zero. We've got lots of sort of key dates along the way. So we've got dates around low and zero carbon homes. We've got near-term targets for scope 1, 2, and 3, etc. So there'll be sort of little hiatuses. There's sort of regulatory influences that will push us in one way or another way. But nevertheless, we've got that sort of firm spine now to deliver against. And I think this is in some ways the beginning, because you look at the direction of travel for the sort of wider nature agenda, we might be looking at net zero transition plans for nature in the same way as we've been looking at net zero transition plans. So scenario analysis, data, looking at dependencies, looking at impacts. So this is kind of part of a broader, longer term view, and leading out with carbon, but really changing the way that business looks deeper into the time horizon, and then makes plans for achieving what it needs to achieve against that long-term planning and time horizon.
Yeah, really interesting points there, Ian. Now expanding, obviously climate is part of a wider set of issues. You mentioned nature. It feels that actually the companies who are going to be successful and who will be on the front foot are those who are able to absorb and understand and rapidly act on this kind of complexity of things that are coming and that companies need to deal with. That almost has to become a core competency to a degree, doesn't it? And what I really love about this discussion is that it just highlights the importance of course, not just strategy, but actually embedding things, bringing things into the day-to-day. And the points you made earlier on, Christy, about creating cultural norms, making things easy. I think it should obviously not be underestimated how bringing all of this into the business as usual, into processes, is so important. And you can actually create huge change. That's probably the only way, really, you can create the scale of change that's required. So fascinating points. We are getting some questions coming in, so I'll turn to those in a moment. But just a reminder to those in the audience to keep sending your questions. Before we go to that, I'd like to visit a topic which is really interesting, and that's about the role of collaboration. So I think all of your industries, your biggest impacts, as we always hear, are outside your organization. We've talked a lot about the things that you're trying to do inside your organization, around your strategy, around the financing, around embedding things into processes, design, and so on. But the bigger picture can't get delivered without collaborating, without partnering with other organizations, institutions, and so on. Could you talk a little bit more about how you're, and of course with customers as well, could you give some examples of how you're doing this and how that is helping you as companies to deliver on your targets, and perhaps how you're also helping others deliver on their ambitions as well? Pia, perhaps back to you on that point.
Okay. So this is probably the most important topic, is really collaboration, because nobody is working in isolation. We are all part of the value chain. And there's also very important collaboration across the different sectors. And so as said before, we all need to have common targets and work together to get there, and understand each other's targets, share data, help each other to go there. And this is really nobody in doing this in isolation. For us, both supplier and customer collaboration is a key. So when we look at Nokia's emissions, our biggest emission is actually coming from the products in use, so the power consumption when the networks are operating 24/7. And everybody using them, also the businesses, enterprises are moving to more digital world. So we also have not only this kind of telecommunication or web scale customers, but also different enterprises are digitalization. So there's really our strategies based on environmental and ESG is based on two different things: how to minimize all the negative impacts like power consumption and material usage, but then also how to maximize the positive impact. So how can we help others how can we help our customers, our suppliers, to actually also minimize the impacts on environmental. So this is really the minimizing the negatives, the footprint, and maximizing the handprint. That's really the strategy, and the collaboration is a key from both sides, really helping our customers, and then also, of course, responding they requirements on what they have on different environmental areas and climate.
Yeah, that's really important to note. The footprint and then the so-called handprint, so the enablement of others, and maybe if you, and this is actually in response to a question, which in fact is on this theme of collaboration. Are there any specific examples of how this collaboration that you found in Nokia is working well? You've mentioned the customer councils. I'm sure there's a lot perhaps in the supply chain. Are there things where, even if it's a small but tangible example of how a particular dialogue, collaboration, or partnership is helping Nokia, with its ambition? I think you've also mentioned in the past, even in the R&D space, obviously, because technology is changing. So pick one of those, but it'd be great to hear a little bit more
all
about
of
that.
Those, right? So one of my favorite topics is working with suppliers. We do organize every year this Supplier Diamond Awards. So we ask suppliers, there's a different team every year, to say, okay, please submit the best things you did for, let's say, for climate or circular economy, whatever is a topic. And then we do have a jury to really evaluate what's happening there, and then recognize the best suppliers. But it really gives such a good insight, so the progress that is happening in different types of suppliers, and how much actually the different industries are working on these topics every year. So it's always very inspiring for me to see the industries that I may not know so well, and how much is happening, and what are the improvements they are making. And with customers, very close collaboration, naturally looking how to work together in for example, the data sharing is currently a very big topic in our industry. Everybody's setting targets, and we really need to understand from Nokia perspective, we need to know what's happening in the supply chain. And then our customers also, they are setting targets and have set targets, and they need data from us, of course, the same way. So it's really the whole value chain. How do we standardize the data sets? How do we help each other to get better KPIs in place? How do we recognize the improvements that are done across the value chain? So this data standardization and data sharing is currently a big collaboration effort in our industry.
Yeah, for sure. There's collaboration in many different areas, and I think you highlighted a couple of really important ones. One is around the data, and just kind of collaboration simply to access more insight on your suppliers, their needs and requirements and positions, and the footprints. And there's also collaboration in terms of actually driving action, actually doing something and acting on decarbonization. Christy, on that theme, there's a lot, I'm sure that, well, there's a lot I know that the industry is doing. Could you give some examples again to the audience question about what have been some really interesting examples that you're doing about collaboration, and how's that helping you and the industry drive that change that is needed?
Yeah, no, I so agree with Pia. Collaboration is essential. And I think coming back to the statistic I shared earlier around offshore wind specifically, with 98% of our emissions for an average wind farm coming from the supply chain, I think that really just shows how important collaboration is. And actually, when I first came into this job, one of the biggest things I noticed actually was that when we communicate our sustainability targets, we often do it in a very corporate high-level way: net zero by 2040, recycle 100% of wind turbine blades by 2030. But oftentimes that's not really translated enough for the supply chain for them to actually know what products and services we want to buy in order to achieve these targets. And for me, that's been a big area of collaboration, of area of focus for me, because it's not actually clear enough for everyone. We're kind of skirting around that sometimes, that there's a very big product development piece that has to happen in between a company setting corporate targets and then expecting the supply chain to respond to that. And that takes time. So we, in the offshore wind area that I work in, we're involved in a number of collaborative spaces that are trying to do that. Specifically, we're in a group called SUSWind, which is looking at blade recycling, and looking at low energy ways of recycling, reusing those, as well as implementing circular economy. And that's product production with the supply chain, as well as it's an opportunity for us to really clearly signal to the supply chain what works for us, what doesn't, what are we actually doing with these blades at the end of life, going much more into the technical details so that we can actually get there together with solutions that work, rather than just sort of saying we're going to need something from you in 2040, but we're not going to necessarily tell you what that is. So we're in a lot of spaces like that. Another good example is QUIC, which is the Coalition for Wind Industry Circularity. So we joined this group, I think, last year. And this one is around establishing a remanufacturing industry for the wind industry generally, onshore and offshore. And again, working with suppliers to make sure that that can happen, us, the OEMs, sharing data about the replacement needs that we have for operational wind farms, so that the supply chain actually has that data and can respond with products and services that work. So a really essential connection of just two people with the same problem coming together to actually solve that with product development. And then I guess very similar to what Pia was saying about data, I can come on to this a little bit later for anyone else who would like more detail on this, but we are of course involved in the SUSGIP, which is a collaborative effort with the Carbon Trust and a number of other offshore wind developers who have come together to produce a common standard for carbon calculations for the offshore wind industry, which has been so important, because this piece on having like commonality, comparability, standardization, not only for wind developers, but also for the supply chains, that they've got a common framework to use, that we're not all asking for completely different things, that the methodology is understood and accessible. There's another key area of collaboration on a joint challenge that's going to also result in better data flowing through the industry, better awareness of when we're going to meet our targets, and what hotspots we're managing to address and what we're not. So collaboration is absolutely key, particularly in that product development space, but also in data sharing.
Hey, building on that really quick comment on is like exactly agree with sharing some requirements for the suppliers. Actually, It's not like you send a letter saying you need to meet this goal, but it's a dialogue, it's a training exercise, really defining what kind of data is needed, what did you mean by your requirement. And for example, we experienced that when we introduced this adding recycled content in our new products, and working with material suppliers, saying what do we actually accept as a recycled content post-consumer inside of the factory. All of these things we really needed to have very detailed process descriptions, translations, educations, site visits, all of that to develop and build the process.
Yeah, really good point. Yes, sharing the challenges as well, isn't it? I think, and having a joint commitment or joint innovation around that. And I think that's also talks to those collaborative initiatives that you mentioned, Christy. Really interesting. Ian, in your sector, how are you seeing collaboration, and what are the examples of where you feel this is working? Perhaps picking up on some of the things that Pia and Christy have said.
Yeah, great. There's a really good story to tell in house building in relation to collaboration. About 3 years ago, an organisation called the Future Homes Hub was set up, which is developer-led and is looking and put together a roadmap for environmental sustainability out to 2050, covering all the major environmental criteria. And since then, there's been a tremendous amount of collaborative work, bringing in not just all the large home builders, but SMEs and others as well, suppliers and government and many parties. And currently we're working with the Carbon Trust on a sector roadmap towards net zero, modelling the overall emissions from the sector across all scopes and the whole value chain. But we've also put quite an intense focus on whole life carbon and embodied carbon. So just I think this week, beta version of an embodied carbon and whole life carbon model was published with some generic criteria in as a starter to start to be able to model the whole life carbon of homes. But that's going to become more sophisticated over time. So that's been a really good milestone and a really good piece of work. I chair a group within the Future Homes Hub on metrics. Currently, the sector reports very differently across a whole range of different ESG metrics, and we're going to look to have a consistent set of environmental metrics for the sector that suit SMEs, that suit PLCs, a slightly wider set, and an additional third set, also looking at data quality and data methodologies. So all of that is a really great sort of example of sector-wide collaboration towards a common long-term goal. I would also like to talk to supply chain collaboration with all the changes around technologies in homes. And there has been a huge amount of supply chain collaboration. So that's not just working out which products are needed, but how those fit into builds and build programs, skills, customer, and maintenance and repair after the homes are built. So there's been a huge piece of work on collaboration around those sorts of technologies. And there's a lot more to come. So we're regularly collaborating now with our supply chain on the embodied elements. So there's many big sort of global materials companies that are well on with this agenda. And so those conversations happen quite freely. But there's also collaboration that's needed, particularly around maybe some private held companies that have got less pressures in this space, and the SME supply chain, which is long and complex in construction, where some help will be needed. So a lot of collaboration already underway and a lot more to go.
Fantastic. A lot happening, Ian, it seems, and I think across everything that you've all been saying, it just shows how important it is to be involved in those collaborations, and actually the breadth of things that this can include, from setting common standards so industry level collaboration, setting common standards, methodologies and tools, and then also I guess collaboration within your own supply chain, with your own suppliers, really important. I'd like to touch on, as we perhaps approach, unfortunately, the closing stages of this session. There's so much we could talk about, but a couple of last topics perhaps to fit in there. One is around financing and the need for finance. Obviously, the changes are massive that need to happen, changes within your own businesses, but also within your value chains, with your wider value chains, your supply chain. How have your organizations been approaching this? Where are you getting this funding from? How do you again try to attract it? Any thoughts on that you could share? Because all of the companies will be having this challenge as well. So how do you address that topic? Perhaps Pia, back to you.
So financing, it's a good question, because sometimes we see that we have a solution which would be like more low carbon solution available, and then in many cases for the new innovative materials, for example, or biofuels, for example, there's additional cost. So and this is, I think, the typical challenge for any new innovation, any change that is happening, that the new things that come to the market, there's originally a bigger cost, and then when the demand is growing, then we'll see the cost going down. So quite often we've seen a good practice is to do some pilots, and really, first of all, it's always trying out something that is different and looking at the benefits, understanding how it works. And then the importance of the collaboration comes in here as well. So business is about supply and demand also. So if you do have a solution that your customer is not interested in, so it could be very difficult to invest in that. So it's really, again, the collaboration, having a common target, and then looking at different ways how to start changing your business practices. And at first, it may be with the additional cost. We've seen, for example, the using of recycled material, plastics content. Sometimes the material is more expensive, and some of the customers are really demanding that they're willing even to pay extra for those products. So this is really case by case, and the customer collaboration and understanding their needs is very important in this.
Yeah. So it's tapping on it's acknowledging the iterative process of this. It's part of making the case. If you make that case, you're able to get that funding. And I think obviously you can tap into perhaps wider industry funding and R&D and so on. So it's working with multiple strands, I guess, at different parts of the business. And Christy, on your end, how does that work in the offshore wind space?
So it's an interesting question that I split into 3 layers maybe for Iberdrola. So the very top layer for us is that our corporate Iberdrola sustainability team has got budget assigned to delivering its ESG targets, which is really fantastic, and I think really important when you have set these ambitious transformational targets that your business is able to recognise that budget is going to need to go behind that. And what we see coming through in that space is our corporate team really scanning for the big challenges that our company is facing in terms of delivering those and scoping out solutions. So one example I'll share is that we have recently invested and co-created a company actually called Energy Loop, which is a blade recycling company, which we are in a partnership with a waste management company called FCC. And over that plant's lifetime, we're expected to invest upwards of 10 million in this plant, and it's really going to be quite a transformational facility to help with dealing with blade recycling, which is us essentially investing in taking responsibility for a challenge that's part of an unfortunate part of our industry that we're really facing head on with that investment. So we do have corporate level investment for those large transformational type challenges facing us. Then at the next level in the offshore business, we have an innovation fund, which again, we portion out to some of the most challenging things that are coming our way, where trials, as Pia was saying, are required before things are really commercially viable at scale, whether that be because of just their unproven technologies or financially they're not accessible at the moment. So that budget is really used to pinpoint those activities and get them developed to a place where they would then become commercial. Which then takes us to project level funding and financing. So these are projects always have shoestrap budgets. That's the name of the game. We're companies at the end of the day, and we're here to produce things at a financially competitive price. And so that is the challenge that project funding will always have. But I think the key here is looking at the budget you have and using it in a really clever way. So an example I want to share is with offshore wind. We have, when we actually come to sell our energy, we've got multiple options available for that. And one that's really coming to the forefront at the moment is power purchase agreements, which was actually really nicely introduced at the beginning of this session. And so here's an example of where we've not actually invested in anything, but we have accidentally, I guess inevitably, by doing this, we've agreed a power purchase agreement with a steel company in Germany, where we'll be selling a large amount of our renewable energy to this company from our Baltic Eagle project, and that is essentially going to electrify their plant. And that's just a fantastic example of kind of a win-win for everyone, because it's not an investment that we've scraped from nowhere. It's selling our product, but to a customer that we use in the industry that's essential for the transformation or achievement of our goals, the decarbonisation of steel, and also essential to them because that's going to help them achieve their targets. It's a very, very win-win situation. It's not investment, but it's just a very clever use of where you move your money. And I would really encourage people to think about that. A lot of this, when budgets are tight, it's about making really pointed, targeted, thought through financial decisions and the power of purchasing, essentially. So that's how it works for us. We've got 3 main levels: investment in the big challenges, and then using our project financing.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Christy. And lastly, to you, Ian, some brief views around financing, how you tap into that.
Well, ours are probably quite sector specific. So home building can be quite cash generative. So we do have pots of money to call on within the business. We've got a revolving credit facility that's a sustainability linked loan that we can pull down if needed, but that's predominantly to buy land. But the core of it goes to the way that land is bought, which is the fundamental raw material for home building. So the way that works is that your build costs are deducted from the land value to get to a price that you pay for the land. So the benefit of that in terms of the carbon agenda is that as standards increase, there's a level playing field, and the value of land goes down rather than the increased need for of course you need to still fund it, but that money comes out of the land value essentially, where there's a level playing field, but from a regulatory perspective. But that's the sort of key part in terms of us being able to put these homes with lots of additional new technologies into the marketplace. There's also sort of internal funding. So we have got a research and development section, and we've done lots of pilots that we've self-funded, and some of them have paid for themselves. So we did 13 hybrid generator trials last week. Hybrid generators or generators go on sites before there's a mains electricity, and with the current price of diesel, we found a cost saving and a substantial carbon saving. So that sorts itself out in terms of the business case for doing that. And for example, we can also mitigate the costs of some of the larger pilots. So we built 5 zero carbon ready homes, but we're selling those into the market, and as part of the conditions of sale, people provide us with post occupancy data in those homes. We offset a lot of the costs of the research through selling the homes back into the market. So there's various things that we can do. So funding hasn't been a major challenge for us today.
So lots of options, and thinking long term and also short term. That's really good points. Well, we've covered so much today, and unfortunately, we'll have to bring things to a close. There's lots of questions, but I really hope that we can carry on the dialogue, certainly with everybody in the audience as well. Do feel free to reach out. But I would like to first thank you, Pia, Christy, Ian. Thank you very much for a really informative session. And to all of you in the audience, thank you for attending today's event. I think there is probably too much to summarize in the last few pithy words, but I do hope that everyone has come away from this session with the knowledge, inspiration, and enthusiasm to tackle the transition planning challenge within your organizations and your networks. What motivates us at Carbon Trust is to help make the transition better and more quickly, accelerating the move to a decarbonized future, and that is our mission. We want to keep the engagement going forward to everyone beyond this event. Like I said, don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I would like to thank everyone again on the panel, Ian, Christy, and Pia. Have a wonderful day, and I hope that we can keep that conversation going. Speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.